My name is Meredith Blondell. I am 35 years old, and I found out my family was bankrupting my grandfather while my mother was busy mocking me for not owning a home. We were sitting at our usual Sunday dinner when my brother Wyatt leaned back in his chair and bragged about the new stone fire pit he just installed at his 5-bedroom estate. My mother smiled at him like he had hung the moon, then turned her gaze to me across the table and asked if I planned on renting that little apartment in Omaha until I was 50. I remember the sound of my brother laughing, a tight, nervous sound that echoed off the dining room walls. I remember my mother shaking her head as if my minimalist lifestyle was a personal insult to the family name. What they did not realize as they passed the gravy and criticized my life choices was that 3 days earlier, my grandfather's attorney had called my cell phone from a private number. And what I found sitting on his mahogany desk the following Monday morning would prove that my brother's perfect life was funded entirely by stolen generational wealth. Before this was over, I would sit at the head of a conference table, lock my own family out of the ancestral farm, and show them exactly what happens when you hand the keys to a data scientist. Welcome back to Fluffy Revenge, where everyday people stop playing the victim and start keeping receipts. If you have ever been the black sheep of your family who is secretly doing better than all of them, drop a comment below and tell me your age and where you are listening from today. Be sure to subscribe because you will want to hear how I used a single flash drive to dismantle my brother's fake real estate empire without ever raising my voice. Let me back up to that Sunday dinner. To understand my family, you have to understand Nebraska. Out here, human worth is measured in acreage and square footage. A 30-year fixed-rate mortgage is not just a loan. It is a moral imperative. If your name is not on a deed, you are considered a transient, a permanent teenager who simply refuses to grow up. My mother Susan enforced this cultural rule like a drill sergeant. She judged every neighbor, cousin, and grocery store clerk by the size of their front lawn. Then there was my older brother Wyatt. Wyatt was a local real estate agent, and he sold the Midwestern dream because he was deeply addicted to it himself. He lived in a sprawling subdivision on the edge of town, a house with too many rooflines and a 3-car garage. On paper, Wyatt was the golden child. He was the one who planted roots. He was the one building equity. He was the man driving a luxury truck he made sure everyone saw parked in the driveway. I went the other way. I work as a data scientist for a regional logistics firm, writing predictive algorithms and cleaning up broken systems. I earn over $100,000 a year, and I choose to rent a clean, quiet loft in the city. I do not want to fix a roof. I do not want to mow 2 acres of grass. I prefer liquidity. I prefer knowing that if my life needs to change, I can pack my belongings into a few boxes and walk away clean. In my mother's eyes, this made me a failure. The dinner table was her favorite place to remind me of this fact. She set down her fork and looked at me with that rehearsed expression of pity she perfected years ago. She told the table that it was such a shame I was throwing my money down a black hole every month. She said that a woman my age should have assets to her name. Wyatt chimed in right on cue. He told me that renting was for people who lacked commitment. He said I was funding my landlord's retirement while my own net worth sat at 0. I did not argue with them. I just took a sip of my iced tea and watched my brother carefully. I build risk models for a living. I look at anomalies. I look at behavior. Wyatt was wearing a golf polo, but the collar was damp with sweat despite the cool room. He kept his phone face down on the table right next to his plate, and his fingers tapped against the wood in a frantic, irregular rhythm. When his screen lit up with a notification, he snatched the phone so fast he nearly knocked over his water glass. Wyatt did not own his life. A bank owned his life. He was leveraged up to his neck, sweating through Sunday dinner, because the math was finally catching up to him. My mother did not see any of that. She only saw the square footage. She asked me when I was going to let Wyatt find me a starter home. She offered to co-sign a loan if my credit was not good enough. I smiled politely and told her I was perfectly happy with my current lease. She sighed loudly and told my father that some people just refuse to build a foundation. My father stared at his plate and said nothing. He was a quiet man who let my mother run the narrative to keep the peace. I let them have their victory. I let them feel superior. I knew that fighting their mythology with logic was a waste of energy. People who base their entire identity on debt do not want to hear about financial freedom. But as I sat there listening to them plan the new landscaping for Wyatt's backyard, my mind drifted back to the phone call I had received on Thursday afternoon. My grandpa Henry was the only person in the family who ever respected my intellect. He ran the ancestral family farm, 300 acres of prime soil that had survived droughts, recessions, and bad harvests. Grandpa Henry taught me how to play chess. He taught me that numbers do not lie, but people do. For the past 6 months, his health had been failing. He was moved into a hospice care facility across the county, and my mother had immediately stepped in to manage his affairs. She visited him twice a week, usually spending more time talking to the nursing staff about her own stress than actually sitting by his bed. Thursday afternoon, my phone rang while I was compiling a quarterly data report. The caller ID showed the office number of Thomas Caldwell, Grandpa Henry's longtime estate attorney. Mr. Caldwell was a man of very few words. He did not call to check in, and he certainly did not call to chat about the weather. When I answered, his voice was tight and strictly professional. He asked if I was in a secure location. I told him I was. He said he needed me to come to his office in downtown Omaha first thing Monday morning before the banks opened their doors to the public. I asked him if Grandpa Henry had passed away. Mr. Caldwell said no. Henry was still holding on, but the situation required my immediate presence. Then he paused, and the silence on the line felt heavy and deliberate. He told me that under no circumstances was I to mention this meeting to my mother or my brother. I agreed and hung up the phone. For the rest of the weekend, I analyzed every possible reason an estate attorney would summon a grandchild in secret while the parent was supposed to be acting as the power of attorney. There was only one logical conclusion. The ledger was wrong, and somebody was trying to hide the math. So I sat at that Sunday dinner, chewing my food, listening to my brother brag about his stone fire pit, and my mother criticize my lack of assets. I watched Wyatt wipe the sweat from his forehead. I watched my mother pour more wine and bask in the illusion of her successful son. I did not say a word about Mr. Caldwell. I just smiled, finished my meal, and waited for Monday morning to arrive. I woke up the next morning in my Omaha loft long before the sun rose. The space was exactly how I wanted it. High ceilings, exposed brick walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the waking city. My mother called this place a temporary dorm room. She refused to acknowledge that this temporary dorm room cost $3,000 a month, an amount I paid effortlessly from a dedicated checking account. My tech salary afforded me a life free from the suffocating anxiety I saw dripping off my brother at the dinner table. I walked into my kitchen, brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, and opened my laptop on the quartz counter. I checked my investment portfolios, my high-yield savings, and my retirement accounts. Every graph pointed upward. My liabilities were zero. I did not owe a bank for the roof over my head. I did not owe a dealership for the car in my parking garage. I possessed the one thing my family desperately lacked, which was true financial liquidity. In our culture, they believed you were not successful unless you were tied to a plot of land by a 30-year chain of debt. I chose to stay unchained. The only person who ever understood that choice was my grandfather Henry. My grandfather was a man who built his life on 300 acres of prime agricultural soil. He wore faded denim and drove a truck that predated my birth. While my mother obsessed over country club memberships and neighborhood prestige, Henry focused on crop yields and equipment depreciation. He was the one who taught me how to read a balance sheet when I was 12 years old, sitting at his scarred wooden kitchen table. He would slide a stack of old farm receipts toward me, hand me a heavy metal calculator, and tell me to find the discrepancies. He noticed my analytical mind early on and cultivated it. He used to look at me over the rim of his coffee mug and say that numbers never lie, but people do. He told me that human beings will construct elaborate stories to justify their greed, but a ledger will always tell the cold, hard truth. Henry respected my intellect. He never asked me when I was going to settle down, buy a house, or pretend to be someone I was not. He just asked me if my math was solid. At 7 in the morning, I locked the door to my pristine apartment and drove downtown. Mr. Caldwell's law firm occupied the 4th floor of a stone building that had stood in Omaha for over a century. The waiting room smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The receptionist had not even arrived yet. Mr. Caldwell was waiting for me by the glass doors. He wore a rumpled suit, and the deep lines around his eyes suggested he had not slept much over the weekend. He guided me into his corner office, closed the heavy oak door, and locked the deadbolt. The sharp click echoed in the quiet room. He offered me a seat in a leather chair across from his mahogany desk. He did not offer me coffee. He sat down, folded his hands over a thick manila file, and looked at me with a grim expression. He said that Henry was declining much faster than the doctors had anticipated. The hospice care team believed it was a matter of days, maybe weeks, if his heart held out. I felt a sharp ache in my chest, a sudden wave of preemptive grief for the only family member who truly saw me. But Caldwell did not give me time to process the sadness. He leaned forward and dropped the first piece of information that would alter the trajectory of my life. A month ago, before his physical condition deteriorated into unresponsiveness, Henry had Caldwell quietly draft a new legal structure for his estate. He bypassed my mother entirely. He bypassed Wyatt without a second thought. The trust had been rewritten in secret, executed behind closed doors, and filed away from the prying eyes of the very people who thought they were next in line to inherit the empire. Caldwell explained that Henry had grown deeply suspicious of how his affairs were being managed. My mother had secured a limited power of attorney earlier in the year to help pay his medical bills and property taxes. Henry suspected she was overstepping her boundaries, but he lacked the physical strength to audit the accounts himself. That was when Caldwell pushed the thick manila folder across the desk. He told me to look at the farm operating accounts. These were the primary reserves the cash pools built over 40 years of profitable soybean and corn harvests. I opened the file. As a data scientist, I do not just look at bottom lines. I look at velocity. I look at frequency, volume, and routing patterns. The numbers printed on those bank statements were staggering, and they were bleeding. The accounts were hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. Over $400,000 was inexplicably missing from the reserves. This was not the result of a bad agricultural season or a dip in commodity prices. This was a systematic extraction. The withdrawals started small, just a few $1,000s here and there, categorized as maintenance expenses or administrative fees. Then the velocity increased. The sums grew larger. 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. The money was being funneled out of Henry's secure accounts and disappearing into a web of unfamiliar routing numbers. Caldwell watched my eyes scan the columns of data. He said that as Henry's attorney, his access to the granular banking details was restricted without explicit authorization from the primary account holder. And since Henry was now incapacitated, the bank was freezing up. Caldwell could see the outflow, but he could not legally stop it or trace the final destination of the funds without initiating a lengthy court battle. A court battle would require notifying my mother, alerting her to the investigation, and giving the thief ample time to cover their tracks. Henry did not want a public scandal while he was still breathing. He wanted proof. I laid the pages out across the polished surface of the desk, arranging them in chronological order. The air in the office felt thin. I traced the dates of the largest wire transfers. My mind immediately mapped them against the timeline of my brother's recent lifestyle upgrades. The $20,000 withdrawal aligned perfectly with the month Wyatt purchased his luxury truck. A staggering $50,000 wire transfer coincided precisely with the down payment on his sprawling 5-bedroom estate. The story my family told the world was that Wyatt was a real estate prodigy, a self-made Midwestern success story. The story written in black ink on the bank statements suggested he was nothing more than a parasite feeding off a dying man. But suspicion is not data, and correlation is not causation. I needed the authorization records. I dug deeper into the folder, pulling out the supplementary documents the bank had provided to Caldwell before the freeze. I found a stack of digital transfer authorization forms, the paperwork required by the rural bank to clear transactions over a certain monetary threshold. I looked at the most recent form, dated just 2 weeks prior. It authorized a wire transfer of $35,000 to an obscure limited liability company. I scanned down to the bottom of the page to check the signature line. In order to move that kind of money, the bank required the signature of the primary account holder or the designated financial proxy. My mother held a limited power of attorney for basic medical and tax expenses, but she did not have the legal clearance to authorize unregulated commercial wire transfers. I stared at the name printed on the digital authorization line. The ink was dark, the letters perfectly legible. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The name on the document did not belong to my grandfather. It did not belong to my mother. It was a name I recognized instantly. A name that possessed zero legal authority, no power of attorney, and no clearance whatsoever to move a single dime of Henry's generational wealth. I asked Mr. Caldwell to make copies of every single ledger page authorization slip and bank statement sitting on his desk. He handed me a thick stack of paper enclosed in a plain manila folder. I walked out of that century-old building and stepped into the brisk morning air. The drive back to my apartment felt entirely different from the drive there. The preemptive grief that had threatened to suffocate me earlier was gone. It was replaced by a cold and calculating clarity. My family had not just made a poor financial decision or mismanaged a few accounts. They had executed a coordinated financial extraction on a dying man. I parked my car in the secure garage, rode the elevator to my floor, and locked the heavy door behind me. I dropped my keys on the counter and spread the physical documents across my kitchen island. I did not shed a tear. I went to work. In my profession, when a corporation experiences a data breach, the initial panic is a useless emotion. You have to isolate the network, identify the corrupted nodes, and trace the digital footprints back to the original source. I decided to treat my own blood relatives the exact same way I would treat a hostile foreign entity hacking into a supply chain server. I opened my primary workstation, a high-performance machine built for heavy computational loads, and established a secure and encrypted workspace. I routed my internet connection through a virtual private network to ensure my digital footprint remained invisible to any local monitoring. I needed a clean environment to dissect their lies. I had to bridge the gap between the paper statements in front of me and the real-world assets my brother claimed to own. I opened a terminal window and began writing custom Python scripts. Rural Nebraska County databases are notoriously outdated, often relying on archaic search functions that intentionally hide more than they reveal. My code was designed to scrape property tax records, limited liability, company registrations, and deed transfers across 3 different local counties. I instructed the algorithm to cross-reference the obscure routing numbers from Henry's missing funds with any corporate entity registered in the state within the past 5 years. I hit execute and walked to the kitchen to pour a second cup of dark roast coffee while the machine chewed through thousands of public records. 10 minutes later, the terminal window flooded with green text. The script had caught the thread. The $35,000 wire transfer I had seen on Mr. Caldwell's desk did not go to a legitimate agricultural supplier. It went to a shell corporation named Great Plains Holdings. I ran a secondary search on the registered agent for that specific entity. The results populated on my screen instantly. The registered agent was my brother Wyatt. He had used a registered office located at a cheap strip mall in a neighboring town to mask his involvement. This was the second layer of the betrayal. I realized I was not looking at a sudden crime of opportunity. This was not a desperate son making a single terrible choice because he fell behind on his utility bills. The data painted a much darker and more sinister picture. I pulled the historical transaction logs and mapped them against the shell company formation dates. The financial bleed had been systematic. It started exactly 3 years ago, just weeks after my grandfather suffered his first minor stroke. They had tested the waters with small withdrawals, probing the bank's security protocols and Henry's declining attention span. When no alarms sounded and no one asked questions, they widened the pipeline. To move the sheer volume of cash they extracted, they needed more than just a passing familiarity with Henry's passwords. They needed a shield of legal cover. I ran a targeted query through the county clerk's digitized legal filings, searching for any notarized documents attaching my mother or brother to Henry's estate. The query returned a single hit. I downloaded the file and stared at my monitor. It was a power of attorney document ostensibly signed by Henry, granting both Susan and Wyatt joint unrestricted financial control over his personal and business accounts. I pulled up a scanned copy of Henry's actual signature from an old chess club membership card I kept on my desk. I overlaid the two signatures on my screen. The differences were subtle, but undeniable to a trained eye. Henry wrote with a heavy and deliberate hand, his letters leaning sharply to the right. The signature on the legal document was too smooth and far too practiced. The loops were tight, mimicking a style rather than living it. Someone had forged my grandfather's name to steal his life savings. My own mother and brother had conspired to bypass the legal safeguards designed to protect a vulnerable old man. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and began building a timeline. In the left column, I logged the dates and amounts of every stolen wire transfer. In the right column, I logged my brother's social media posts and his public real estate acquisitions. The correlation was flawless. The day after a $42,000 withdrawal cleared the shell company account, Wyatt posted a photo of his brand new luxury truck, thanking his real estate clients for a record-breaking month. An $85,000 transfer preceded his sprawling 5-bedroom estate purchase by exactly 48 hours. The custom stone fire pit my mother had bragged about at Sunday dinner was funded by a direct draft from Henry's emergency tractor repair fund. As I sat in my quiet, rented loft, the sheer scale of their hypocrisy washed over me. For 15 years, they had weaponized their supposed success to make me feel small. They mocked my lack of a mortgage. They treated my financial caution as a severe character flaw. Yet every brick in Wyatt's house, every gallon of gas in his truck, and every tailored shirt on his back belonged to a dying man who had worked the soil with his bare hands for 4 decades. They were not successful. They were actors playing a role using stolen funds as their props to maintain an illusion of Midwestern grandeur. But actors eventually run out of funding. I turned my analytical focus to the deed and mortgage records tied to Wyatt's 5-bedroom estate. When you dig into property records, you often find the true cost of arrogance. Wyatt had not secured a traditional 30-year fixed-rate loan. His credit history was likely too damaged from his other flashy purchases to qualify. Instead, he had signed a predatory short-term financing agreement known as a balloon mortgage. This structure provided him with artificially low monthly payments for the first 3 years, requiring a ruinous lump sum payoff at the end of the term. He had gambled his entire lifestyle on the assumption that he would inherit Henry's wealth before the bill came due. I checked the origination date of his loan. I counted forward 3 years. My breath caught in my throat. The balloon payment was due in exactly 14 days. If Wyatt did not produce a 6-figure lump sum by that strict deadline, the bank would foreclose on his crown jewel. He would lose the house, the equity, and the facade he had built his entire identity around. I looked back at the spreadsheet containing Henry's farm reserves. The accounts were tapped out. Susan and Wyatt had drained the liquid cash dry, leaving just enough to keep the automatic utility payments from bouncing. The stolen money was gone, squandered on depreciating assets and inflated egos. Wyatt's deadline was rapidly approaching, and he did not have the capital to save himself. A man staring down the barrel of public humiliation and financial ruin will not simply accept his fate. He will look for another source of capital. He will make a desperate move to keep his illusion alive. And looking at my own healthy bank balances, I knew exactly who he was going to target next. I sat by the window at a quiet coffee shop in downtown Omaha the following afternoon. I had my laptop open, reviewing the spreadsheet I built the night before. The numbers glared back at me, forming a digital autopsy of my grandfather's life savings. I took a sip of black coffee and watched the afternoon foot traffic on the sidewalk outside. Then the bell above the door chimed, and a familiar figure walked through the entrance. It was Wyatt. He did not work in Omaha, and he certainly did not drink artisanal pour-over coffee. He had tracked me down. He spotted me in the corner, pasted on a grin that did not reach his eyes, and swaggered over to my table. He wore a tailored suit jacket over a crisp white shirt, the uniform of a man trying very hard to project wealth. But the jacket hung a little too loosely on his frame, and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights of a debtor running out of time. He pulled out the chair across from me without asking and sat down heavily. He signaled a passing barista and ordered a black coffee, acting as though he owned the establishment. He started the conversation with his usual condescension. He looked around the small cafe, then glanced at my laptop screen, which I had quickly minimized. He asked how the apartment life was treating me. He said he could never survive sharing walls with strangers, stating that a real man needs acres and privacy to breathe. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table, attempting to assert physical dominance in the small space. He told me that being the head of the family required vision, something he claimed I lacked because I preferred the safety of a rented box. I let him talk. I watched the nervous twitch in his jaw. I knew exactly why he was sitting across from me, and it had nothing to do with offering unsolicited real estate advice. After 5 minutes of inflating his own ego, the pivot arrived. He cleared his throat, adjusted his expensive watch, and lowered his voice. He framed his request as a temporary cash flow hiccup. He claimed the real estate market was experiencing a slight seasonal dip, and a few of his biggest commissions were delayed in escrow. He said a man with a portfolio as diverse as his sometimes encounters minor liquidity issues. He asked for a bridge loan. He wanted $20,000. He promised to pay me back with interest in 30 days. He smiled that same tight, anxious smile I had seen at Sunday dinner. I sat perfectly still. $20,000 was a fraction of what he needed to cover the looming balloon payment on his 5-bedroom estate. But it was enough to satisfy the most immediate creditors and buy him a few more weeks of breathing room. He thought I was an easy target, a quiet sister with a high salary and low overhead, who could be bullied into opening her checkbook. I looked him in the eye and delivered a calm, practiced refusal. I told him I did not lend money to family. His smile vanished. The polished veneer cracked, exposing the frantic predator underneath. His face flushed a dark shade of red. He asked me what I spent my 6-figure salary on, if not to help my own blood. He demanded to know why I was hoarding cash while he was out there building an empire for the Blondell name. I closed my laptop and placed my hands flat on the table. I told him his empire was his responsibility, not mine, and that real adults fund their own visions. Wyatt stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, drawing the attention of several patrons. He leaned over the table, his face inches from mine, and lowered his voice to a hostile whisper. He warned me that Grandpa Henry was fading fast, and the family business would soon undergo a transition. He threatened to speak with our parents and ensure I was cut out of the estate entirely. He said people who do not contribute to the soil do not reap the harvest. He promised I would walk away with nothing while he took control of the legacy. The irony of his threat was profound. He was trying to banish me from a kingdom I already owned. I watched him storm out of the cafe, get into his luxury truck, and drive away, unaware that he had just threatened the sole legal trustee of his coveted inheritance. That evening, the retaliation continued. I was in my kitchen preparing dinner when my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. Wyatt had obviously run straight to her, spinning a narrative of my supposed cruelty. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone. Susan did not bother saying hello. She launched into a calculated guilt trip, weaponizing her particular brand of Midwestern shame. She asked me how I could sleep at night knowing my brother was under stress. She said Wyatt was a visionary, a man trying to elevate our family status in the community, and I was being selfish for refusing to support him. She told me that real Nebraskans step up when their family needs them, that we carry each other through the hard times. She called my minimalist lifestyle unpatriotic and ungrateful. She said if I refused to act like a part of this family, they would start treating me like a stranger. I listened to her speech without interrupting. I recognized the tactic. It was the same manipulative strategy they had used for 15 years to keep me feeling small and indebted. When she finished her tirade expecting an apology or a tearful capitulation, I simply told her to have a good night and ended the call. I walked away from the kitchen and returned to my workstation. Wyatt's threat earlier that afternoon had bothered me. I was not worried about disinheritance, but the sheer confidence behind his words was troubling. He acted like a man who had a contingency plan already in motion. The missing farm reserves were nearly exhausted, yet he still needed a staggering influx of cash to save his house from the bank. If the liquid accounts were dry, the only remaining value in the estate was the land itself. I needed to know who Wyatt was communicating with outside of our immediate circle. I logged into the cellular provider portal. Years ago, I had set up the family phone plan for my grandfather, placing all the lines under Henry's name to secure a bulk discount. Because I was the technical administrator on the account, I still had full legal access to the billing dashboards and call logs. I downloaded Wyatt's outgoing call history for the past 90 days and exported the raw data into a fresh spreadsheet. I ran a frequency analysis, filtering out known contacts, clients, and family members. I was looking for repeated, high-duration calls to unknown numbers occurring during non-business hours. The algorithm isolated a specific phone number. Over the past 3 weeks, Wyatt had dialed this number 42 times, often late at night, and immediately following his visits to the hospice center. I took the 10-digit number and ran a reverse directory search through public business registries. The result popped up on my screen, illuminating the dark room. The number belonged to a local notary public named Brenda Vance. I pulled up her business address on a digital map. She did not operate out of a law firm, a bank, or a municipal building. Her office was located in the back of a dilapidated strip mall on the outskirts of town, sandwiched between a discount liquor store and a vacant lot. A legitimate real estate agent dealing with multi-million-dollar transactions does not use a strip mall notary at midnight. I cross-referenced her name with the forged power of attorney document I had discovered earlier. The puzzle pieces clicked together with terrifying precision. Wyatt was not just stealing cash from the operating accounts. He was preparing to steal the soil. The realization washed over me. He was fabricating documents that required an official state seal, and he had found a willing accomplice to rubber stamp the fraud. The digital trail I uncovered the previous night could only take my investigation so far. While algorithms excel at identifying financial anomalies and exposing hidden corporate structures, certain foundational truths remain securely locked inside physical filing cabinets in municipal basements. I needed tangible evidence to prove the depth of my family's betrayal. Early the next morning, I bypassed my usual route to the tech campus and drove 50 miles west into the heart of the neighboring county. The landscape outside my car window shifted from the polished glass architecture of Omaha to an endless grid of cornfields, rusted grain silos, and gravel roads. This was the environment my family worshipped. This was the soil they used to measure human value. I parked in front of the county clerk's office, a squat brick building that looked unchanged since the late 1970s. The interior smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and decaying paper. I walked up to the counter and requested access to the public property records tied to my grandfather's specific parcel numbers. The elderly clerk behind the glass did not ask questions. She simply retrieved a heavy canvas-bound ledger from the archives and dropped it onto a scratched wooden viewing table in the back corner of the room. I took a seat and opened the heavy cover. I flipped through decades of meticulous agricultural history. I saw original deed transfers, clean tax assessments, and the pristine records of a man who never purchased what he could not afford to pay for in cash. Henry treated debt like a disease, avoiding it at all costs. I turned to the final section of the binder, which housed the most recent filings. A newly recorded lien stared back at me, freshly stamped and officially logged by the county. It was a secondary mortgage agreement. I analyzed the terms of the contract. My brother Wyatt was listed as the primary borrower. The amount borrowed was staggering, matching the exact six-figure sum required to cover the impending balloon payment on his sprawling estate. But Wyatt lacked the credit history and the liquid assets to secure that kind of capital on his own merit. Traditional lenders would have taken one look at his debt-to-income ratio and denied the application instantly. To bypass the underwriters, Wyatt needed high-value collateral. He needed an ironclad guarantor. The document listed my grandfather as the sole guarantor. The agreement pledged the entire 300-acre ancestral farm against my brother's reckless personal debt. I leaned closer to examine the signature block at the bottom of the page. The name Henry Blondell was inscribed in dark blue ink. A lifetime of reading my family's birthday cards, passive-aggressive post-it notes, and grocery lists allowed me to instantly identify the true author of that signature. The handwriting did not belong to the tired, failing man lying in the hospice bed. The cursive contained distinct sharp ascenders and tight, rigid loops. The baseline slant leaned heavily to the left, indicating a hurried, forceful grip. It was an exact match for my mother. Susan had forged her own father's signature to hand over his legacy to her golden child. Next to the fraudulent signature sat the official state seal. The ink stamp read, Brenda Vance, Notary Public. This was the woman from the strip mall, the target of Wyatt's late-night phone calls. I pulled out my phone and cross-referenced her name with my brother's social media network. Wyatt kept his primary professional profiles highly curated, portraying the flawless image of a successful single real estate mogul. But careless people always leave digital breadcrumbs behind. I located a hidden secondary account Wyatt used to follow local bars and golf courses. Nested in a tagged photo from a cheap regional casino posted just weeks before the mortgage was filed was a picture of Wyatt with his arm wrapped tightly around Brenda Vance. They were not merely business associates facilitating a legal transaction. They were romantically involved. Wyatt was dating his accomplice, leveraging a cheap romance to bypass legal safeguards and commit felony fraud. The gravity of the situation locked my jaw. This was the fourth layer of their deception, and it carried catastrophic consequences for the entire estate. The secondary mortgage tied Wyatt's impending financial collapse directly to the ancestral land. When his deadline arrived in 14 days, and he inevitably failed to produce the capital to satisfy his initial balloon payment, his house of cards would crumble. The creditors would not just repossess his luxury truck or seize his 5-bedroom house. They would activate the guarantee clause on the fraudulent secondary mortgage. They would bypass him entirely and initiate foreclosure proceedings on the family farm. My grandfather spent 40 years protecting that soil. Now, because of my mother's blind devotion and my brother's unchecked ego, a regional bank held the power to auction the property off to the highest bidder. I realized I was the only person standing between the bank and the land. As the secret trustee of the estate, I possessed the legal authority to block the foreclosure, but deploying that power too early would ruin the strategy. If Susan and Wyatt discovered I controlled the estate before I locked down every single stolen dollar, they would panic. They would destroy their communication records, liquidate any remaining assets, and bury the money where I could never trace it. I had to thread a very narrow needle. I had to figure out how to stop a bank from seizing an asset I was legally bound to protect without revealing to my family that I held the shield. I closed the heavy canvas binder and carried it back to the front counter. I requested certified copies of the fraudulent mortgage agreement and the forged signature page. I paid the municipal processing fee in cash to avoid leaving a digital trail, folded the certified copies into my briefcase, and walked out into the harsh Midwestern sunlight. The heat radiated off the concrete pavement, mirroring the rising pressure in my chest. I unlocked my car and tossed the briefcase onto the passenger seat. I needed to return to Omaha and consult with Mr. Caldwell immediately. We had to draft a silent injunction or find a loophole in the bank's underwriting process to stall the lien. I put the key in the ignition, but before I could start the engine, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The notification displayed a text message from my father, Richard. My father was a man who chose the path of least resistance in every aspect of his life. He spent his entire marriage letting Susan dictate the family narrative, often retreating to his garage or the yard to avoid the crossfire. Susan kept him entirely in the dark regarding the financial extractions and the legal maneuverings. He believed the farm was safe. He believed Wyatt was highly successful. He was merely a bystander in his own home, content to ignore the tension as long as it did not require him to take a stand. Because of his passive nature, he rarely texted me, and when he did, it usually concerned mundane topics like the weather or car maintenance. The message glowing on my screen contained only 2 sentences, and it lacked his usual detached tone. The words were frantic, typed in obvious haste. Grandpa Henry took a sudden turn for the worse, and his breathing changed. The nurses say he is unresponsive and you need to get to the hospice center right now. I arrived at the county hospice center 20 minutes after my father sent his panicked text message. The building smelled of harsh antiseptic, stale coffee, and impending finality. I bypassed the main reception desk and walked directly toward the intensive care wing. I found my family occupying a private waiting alcove situated just outside my grandfather's room. My father, Richard, sat hunched over in a vinyl chair, staring blankly at the linoleum floor. He looked visibly aged, deflated by the sudden reality of losing the man who had anchored this family for decades. He rubbed his hands together in a repetitive, nervous motion, trapped in his own quiet devastation. Susan and Wyatt, however, were engaged in a masterful theatrical performance. They stood near the central nurse station, putting on a public display of grief designed for an audience of charting medical staff. They were playing the role of the devastated, loving heirs. I watched them from the end of the hallway before stepping into their line of sight. In any data set, the outliers reveal the true story. Real grief is paralyzing. It makes you forget your posture. It strips away your vanity. Susan stood with flawless posture, ensuring her designer cardigan remained unwrinkled while she squeezed a passing nurse's hand. She offered a trembling smile and whispered about how hard this loss would be for the community. She did not mention our family. She mentioned the community, always hyper-aware of her social standing. Wyatt stood beside her, offering tight, solemn nods to the staff, but his jaw remained clenched and his eyes darted toward the exit doors every few seconds. The tension radiating off his rigid frame had nothing to do with Henry's failing heartbeat. It had everything to do with a looming balloon mortgage and a ticking clock. A young doctor in blue scrubs walked out of Henry's room and approached my father. He spoke in a low, measured voice, explaining that Henry's vital signs were dropping rapidly, and the transition phase was beginning. My father buried his face in his hands, unable to process the clinical terminology. Susan immediately guided Richard back to his vinyl chair, murmuring soothing words that sounded exactly like a rehearsed script. I stepped backward, fading into the background, utilizing a survival skill I had perfected over 3 decades in that house. I told my mother I was going to find the cafeteria to bring back coffee for everyone. She waved me off without looking in my direction, entirely focused on maintaining her performance for the surrounding doctors. I walked down the corridor, but I did not head toward the cafeteria. I slipped into an adjoining service hallway that mirrored the main waiting area, separated only by a thin partition wall used to store surplus medical carts and fresh linens. A moment later, I heard the distinctive click of my mother's heels striking the floor tiles, followed closely by the heavy thud of my brother's boots. They had stepped away from my father to speak privately in the alcove. I stood motionless behind a towering stack of folded blankets. Their voices drifted through the partitions, stripped entirely of the sorrow they had projected moments earlier. Susan spoke in a rapid, calculating cadence. She told Wyatt they needed to secure the farmhouse study before the attending physician officially pronounced the time of death. She explained that once Henry passed, the state would officially seal the property pending the probate process, making it a criminal offense to remove items from the residence. Wyatt's voice trembled as he asked about the floor safe. He said Henry kept every original draft of his will and decades of handwritten financial ledgers locked in the heavy steel vault beneath his desk. If an estate auditor found those physical ledgers, their forged notary stamps, and the drained accounts would be instantly exposed. The digital records I had scraped from the county databases proved the mechanics of their fraud, but Henry's personal ledgers provided the undeniable intent. Those handwritten books were the only physical proof that Henry never authorized the transfer of his legacy. Susan told my brother to stop hyperventilating. She pulled a set of brass keys from her purse and instructed Wyatt to drive to the farm immediately. She told him to bypass the security code, empty the floor safe, and burn the ledgers in his brand-new stone fire pit. She ordered him to destroy the evidence and return to the hospital before anyone noticed his absence. A new layer of conflict crystallized in my mind. If Wyatt burned those books, the forgery case would devolve into a battle of circumstantial evidence. I could not let my brother reach that farmhouse first. I heard Susan walk back toward the waiting room to console my father. Wyatt's heavy footsteps hurried toward the main elevator bank. I turned and sprinted down the emergency stairwell, taking the concrete steps 2 at a time. I burst through the side exit doors and hit the pavement running. The heavy humidity of the Midwestern afternoon had finally broken, giving way to a severe summer thunderstorm. Black clouds rolled across the flat Nebraska horizon, unleashing a torrential downpour. I reached my car soaked to the bone and started the engine. The drive from the medical center to the ancestral farm typically took 30 minutes under clear conditions. I had to do it in 20. Rain lashed against the windshield in thick sheets, obscuring the gravel roads. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the endless rows of corn like strobe lights in a dark room. I pushed my vehicle to its mechanical limit, gripping the steering wheel as the tires hydroplaned over deep puddles. Wyatt drove a heavy lifted luxury truck that handled poorly on slick rural backroads. I banked on his arrogance, slowing him down. My smaller sedan gripped the asphalt tighter, allowing me to navigate the sharp county curves with mathematical precision. I turned onto the familiar dirt driveway. The property sat in total darkness, a sprawling silhouette standing against the storm. I parked my car behind a rusted tractor shed, where it would not be visible from the main road. I grabbed a small flashlight from my glove compartment and ran toward the back porch. I knew where my grandfather hid his spare key, tucked inside a hollowed-out piece of firewood near the back door. My hands were freezing as I twisted the lock and slipped inside. The house smelled of old wood pipe tobacco and impending emptiness. I navigated the dark kitchen and moved straight to the study. The room remained exactly as Henry had left it. A heavy oak desk anchored the center of the space. I pushed aside the thick woven rug near his leather reading chair. Beneath the rug, a false floorboard concealed the heavy steel face of the floor safe. I knelt down and wiped the dust from the interface. It was a hybrid model featuring both a biometric thumbprint scanner and a digital numerical keypad. I obviously could not provide Henry's fingerprint, which meant I had to defeat the digital lock. In my profession, bypassing a security protocol requires understanding the psychology of the architect. I knew my grandfather. He was a man of the soil, a farmer who trusted the earth far more than he trusted technology. He would never use a random string of generated numbers for a passcode. He would use a sequence that held permanent, unalterable meaning. I thought about the lessons he taught me at the kitchen table. He always said the most important year in a farmer's life is the year he survives a severe drought. I recalled the specific year a historic drought nearly bankrupted this county. I typed the 4 digits into the keypad. A red light flashed on the panel indicating an incorrect entry. I paused, regulating my breathing to keep the panic at bay. The keypad allowed 3 attempts before initiating a permanent lockout protocol. I thought deeper. Henry respected exact data. He measured his success in precise yields. The very first year he ever turned a profit on this land, he harvested a highly specific number of bushels per acre. He had a framed receipt of that historic sale hanging directly above his desk. 142 bushels per acre sold in the year 1976. I typed the sequence 14276. A heavy mechanical click echoed in the quiet study. The steel bolts retracted. I pulled the heavy door upward, revealing the dark cavity below. Inside rested a stack of manila envelopes and a thick, leather-bound ledger. As my fingers brushed the worn leather spine, a sweeping beam of bright light sliced through the study window. I froze in place. The headlights of a luxury truck illuminated the rain-streaked glass. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over the gravel driveway signaled that my time had expired. Wyatt had arrived. He parked directly in front of the house, leaving his engine running and his headlights blazing. I pulled the heavy ledger from the safe and shoved it under my jacket. I lowered the steel door, letting it latch shut, and kicked the rug back into place to hide the floorboard. Heavy boots stomped onto the wooden planks of the front porch. I backed out of the study and moved silently into the dark hallway, heading toward the rear kitchen exit, just as the metallic scrape of Wyatt's key turning in the front door lock shattered the silence of the empty house. The heavy brass deadbolt on the front door clicked open just as I slipped through the rear kitchen exit. I pulled the wooden door shut behind me, wincing at the faint metallic scrape of the latch. Inside the house, I could hear Wyatt shouting, his heavy boots pounding against the hardwood floors as he rushed directly toward the study. I did not wait to hear him tear the rug back. I sprinted across the flooded backyard, my shoes sinking deep into the Nebraska mud, the leather ledger tucked safely inside my waterproof jacket. The storm raged overhead, cloaking my escape in sheets of gray rain and rolling thunder. I reached my sedan, threw myself into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I kept the headlights off. I navigated the long gravel driveway by the faint illumination of the lightning flashes, easing my car onto the paved county road before finally engaging the lights. I drove for 10 miles, putting a safe distance between myself and the ancestral property, until I found a deserted dirt access road bordered by towering stalks of corn. I pulled over, shifted into park, and turned on the small dome light above my head. The interior of the car was silent, except for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof. I unzipped my jacket and pulled out the heavy leather book. The cover was worn smooth from decades of use, and it smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and damp earth. I rested it on the steering wheel and opened the first page. What I saw inside fundamentally altered my understanding of the man lying in the hospice bed. My grandfather was a product of the 1980s farm crisis, a brutal economic era that taught him never to trust a bank and to document every single penny that entered or exited his life. He applied that same ruthless precision to his own flesh and blood. This was the 5th layer of the betrayal, and it carried a devastating emotional weight. Henry knew. He knew everything. The ledger was filled with columns of data written in Henry's distinct heavy cursive. He had not been staring blankly at the television during those long months of his physical decline. He had been quietly monitoring his own financial ruin. He documented the exact dates and amounts of the cash withdrawals my mother and brother orchestrated. His handwritten figures matched my encrypted digital spreadsheets with flawless accuracy. He tracked the unauthorized wire transfers to the shell corporation Wyatt established. He even noted the specific days Susan visited the house alone, correlating those visits with the disappearance of blank checks from his desk drawer. Henry possessed the sharpest analytical mind I had ever encountered, but his body had betrayed him. He lacked the physical stamina to confront a daughter who would lie to his face and a grandson who would resort to forgery. He could not drive to the bank to halt the transactions, and he knew a public accusation without ironclad proof would only result in Susan declaring him legally incompetent. So he chose a different battlefield. He transformed his silence into a weapon, meticulously building a fraud case against his own heirs, from the confines of his leather reading chair. I turned to the very last entry in the book. Tucked between the heavy parchment pages was a single piece of stationery folded in half and bearing my name on the outside. I opened the note. The handwriting was shaky, a stark contrast to the firm strokes of the earlier pages indicating it had been written recently as his strength faded. The message was brief. It read, "I let them think I was blind so you could catch them in the light." I stared at those words for a long time. My family had spent my entire adult life trying to convince me that I was a failure because I refused to play their game of debt and appearance. But Henry saw the truth. He recognized that my independence was not a flaw, but a tactical advantage. I did not cry. Crying is a useless biological response when you are holding the final piece of evidence required to destroy a criminal conspiracy. I folded the note, placed it back inside the ledger, and drove back to Omaha. The next morning, the harsh sunlight of a clear Midwestern sky poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment. I had not slept. I spent the night integrating Henry's physical records into my digital presentation, building an airtight chain of custody. At 8 o'clock, my cell phone vibrated on the quartz kitchen counter. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I answered on the third ring, keeping my voice groggy to feign sleep. Susan did not bother with pleasantries. Her tone was icy, dripping with suspicion. She asked me exactly where I went after I left the hospital waiting room yesterday afternoon. I told her I drove back to my apartment because the storm was getting worse, and I had early meetings scheduled for Monday morning. Susan let a long, calculated silence stretch across the line. Wyatt had obviously found something wrong at the farmhouse. Perhaps he noticed a wet footprint on the floorboards, or the rug covering the safe was not perfectly aligned. He had opened the vault to find the ledgers missing, and panic had set in. They were searching for a suspect, but their inherent arrogance made it difficult for them to believe I was capable of outsmarting them. Susan decided to probe further. She said Wyatt drove out to the farm to check on the property and thought he saw a car matching my description on the county road. She suggested it was highly inappropriate for me to visit the house without her permission, while Henry was on his deathbed. I kept my breathing steady and replied that Wyatt must have been mistaken by the rain. I asked her why it would matter if I visited the house I grew up in. That question triggered her defensive instincts. Susan operated on a strict hierarchy, and she felt the urgent need to put me back in my designated place. She adopted her most condescending voice, the same one she used at Sunday dinners. She told me that managing a 300-acre estate requires a level of sophistication I simply did not possess. She said that renters do not get a say in land matters, and that I should focus on my little apartment lease, rather than worrying about the future of the Blondell property. I let her talk, knowing that arrogant people love the sound of their own voice so much they often forget to filter their words. I agreed with her, adopting a meek tone, and said I assumed she and Wyatt would just maintain the farm exactly as Henry left it. The trap snapped shut. Susan scoffed loudly. She said maintaining an obsolete farming operation was a waste of potential equity. She wanted to hurt my feelings by proving how much control she wielded over the family legacy, and in doing so, she handed me the final piece of their timeline. She boasted that visionaries do not cling to the past. She said Wyatt had already found a highly lucrative opportunity, and they had signed a preliminary contract to sell 50 acres of the southern pasture to a commercial developer. The words hung in the air. I ended the call shortly after citing a work conflict and stared at my phone. A new urgent conflict crystallized in my mind. The fraudulent secondary mortgage was not a long-term gamble. It was a temporary bridge loan. Wyatt never intended to pay the bank back with his own money. He and Susan had orchestrated a deal to liquidate a massive portion of Henry's ancestral land to a corporate buyer. They planned to use the cash from the commercial sale to clear Wyatt's balloon payment and erase the forged lien before the estate ever went into probate. They were carving up my grandfather's legacy to hide their own crimes, and the preliminary contract meant the developers were already moving forward with zoning approvals. If that sale closed, 50 acres of prime agricultural soil would be paved over for a retail distribution center, and the financial trail proving Wyatt's fraud would be buried under a mountain of corporate legal paperwork. The clock was no longer ticking down to a 14-day mortgage default. It was ticking down to a commercial real estate closing that could happen at any moment. I possessed the legal authority as the sole trustee to block the sale, but stepping out of the shadows now would trigger a retaliatory strike from my brother that I needed to prepare for. I packed the ledger into my briefcase, grabbed my car keys, and headed straight for Mr. Caldwell's office. I walked into Mr. Caldwell's office carrying the heavy leather ledger I had extracted from my grandfather's floor safe just hours prior. The morning sky over Omaha remained overcast, mirroring the grim reality resting inside my briefcase. The receptionist waved me through, recognizing the urgency in my stride. Caldwell sat behind his mahogany desk reviewing a stack of probate precedents. I did not bother with pleasantries. I set the briefcase down, opened the brass clasps, and slid the worn leather book across the polished wood. Caldwell adjusted his glasses and opened the cover. I watched his eyes scan the columns of handwritten data tracing the exact dates and monetary figures Henry had meticulously recorded as his own daughter and grandson drained his life savings. The color drained from the attorney's face. He recognized the profound weight of what he was holding. This was not just a record of theft. It was the dying testimony of a man who realized his bloodline was tainted by greed. I gave Caldwell a moment to process the handwritten evidence before I delivered the next critical piece of intelligence. I informed him about my mother's arrogant confession on the phone that morning. I detailed the preliminary contract Susan and Wyatt had signed to sell 50 acres of the southern pasture to a commercial developer. Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, processing the timeline. The strategy became crystal clear to both of us. Wyatt was treating the ancestral soil as a disposable asset to cover his fraudulent secondary mortgage. Commercial real estate transactions move quickly when developers are eager to break ground. If the corporate buyer wired the funds into the estate accounts before Henry officially passed away, Susan could authorize a secondary wire to clear Wyatt's balloon payment. The forged lien would vanish, the bank would be satisfied, and the physical proof of their underlying fraud would be buried beneath a newly paved retail distribution center. We had to intercept the transaction, but stepping into the light to file a public lawsuit would tip our hand too early. If Susan realized I held the legal authority of the trust, she would pivot, perhaps challenging my grandfather's mental competency at the time the new trust was drafted. I needed a mechanism to kill the commercial sale without leaving my fingerprints on the weapon. Caldwell smiled, a rare and sharp expression that revealed decades of legal warfare experience. He explained a tactic used in property law known as clouding the title. As the named trustee of the newly formed trust, I possessed the fiduciary duty to protect the assets. Caldwell drafted a silent injunction, a quiet legal notice filed directly with the county clerk, indicating that the parcel of land in question was subject to a pending internal audit and unverified ownership disputes. Corporate developers are inherently risk-averse. They rely on clean titles and seamless zoning approvals. They do not purchase agricultural land embroiled in quiet legal disputes because a clouded title means they cannot secure construction insurance or municipal permits. Caldwell filed the injunction electronically before the lunch hour concluded. The trap was set hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic paperwork. 2 days later, the trap snapped shut. The commercial developer ran their mandatory pre-closing title search, discovered the legal cloud hanging over the 50 acres, and instantly terminated the preliminary contract. They pulled their earnest money and walked away. Wyatt lost his lifeline in the span of a single afternoon. The balloon payment on his 5-bedroom estate resumed ticking like a bomb, and he had exhausted every avenue of escape. Panic breeds irrationality, and irrational men look for a scapegoat. Wyatt could not fathom that a quiet legal mechanism had undone his masterpiece. He assumed human interference. Specifically, he assumed my interference. He knew I had visited the farmhouse during the storm. He knew I asked uncomfortable questions. In his frantic state, he convinced himself that I had somehow discovered the commercial deal and placed an anonymous call to the buyer, perhaps fabricating a story about soil contamination or zoning violations to sabotage his payout. Wyatt decided to teach me a lesson about power. He wanted to remind me that in Nebraska, people without property are vulnerable. He could not touch my bank accounts, and he could not impact my career in the tech sector, but he knew how the regional real estate network operated. The Midwest relies heavily on a deeply entrenched system of quiet favors, country club handshakes, and mutual benefit among property owners. Wyatt was a mid-tier agent, but he golfed with men who controlled thousands of rental units across the state. I finished a grueling deployment cycle at my logistics firm and drove home on a Thursday evening. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the downtown Omaha skyline. I parked in my secure garage, rode the elevator to my floor, and walked down the quiet carpeted hallway. A bright neon green piece of paper was taped directly over my peephole. I pulled the document off the wood and read the bold black lettering printed across the top. It was a 3-day notice to quit. An official eviction warning. I unlocked my door, stepped inside my pristine apartment, and read the fabricated claims listed on the legal notice. The property management company accused me of multiple severe lease violations. The document cited unauthorized commercial activity, claiming I was running a disruptive server farm out of a residential unit. It listed 3 separate noise complaints filed by anonymous neighbors at 3 in the morning. It cited a breach of the community code of conduct. None of it was true. I lived a quiet, solitary life, rarely hosting guests and never generating noise. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. It belonged to the regional director of the property management group. I recognized the name immediately. He was a frequent presence on Wyatt's social media feeds, often tagged in photos from weekend golf tournaments and charity real estate banquets. Wyatt had called in a favor. He had asked his golf buddy to fabricate a paper trail and terminate my lease, weaponizing my status as a renter to render me homeless. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message illuminated the screen. It was from Wyatt. "Told you renting was for losers. Good luck on the street." He expected a reaction. He wanted me to call him in a panic, begging for a retraction. He wanted me to experience the same suffocating desperation he felt when the commercial developer backed out of the land sale. He assumed I lived paycheck to paycheck like the majority of his clients, and that losing my apartment would shatter my stability. I did not panic. I did not shed a tear. I walked into my kitchen, tossed the neon green eviction notice into the trash can, and opened my laptop. I logged into my primary financial dashboard. The screen populated with my investment portfolios, my stock options, and my high-yield savings accounts. For 15 years, I had lived far beneath my means. While my brother funneled his commissions into depreciating luxury vehicles and leveraged real estate to impress his neighbors, I had quietly hoarded capital. I looked at my liquid cash balance. The number staring back at me was formidable, a towering sum of untouched financial ammunition. I did not need to fight a fabricated eviction battle in housing court. I did not need to plead with a corrupt property manager or justify my existence to a brother drowning in debt. I had the resources to change the rules of engagement entirely. I pulled out my phone and composed a new text message. I did not reply to Wyatt. I opened a thread with my own private real estate broker, a woman who specialized in unlisted premium urban properties. I sent her a single directive. It is time. My real estate broker understood my parameters perfectly. I did not want a sprawling estate that required constant maintenance, nor did I want to reside in a sterile new development. I requested structural integrity, privacy, and a quiet street in one of the most desirable historic neighborhoods in Omaha. By Friday morning, I was standing inside a mid-century brick home flanked by mature oak trees. The property boasted clean architectural lines, restored hardwood floors, and a dedicated office space wrapped in natural light. The seller was highly motivated, relocating out of state and seeking a fast transaction. I did not require a bank inspection. I did not need to submit to a 30-year loan approval process or beg a mortgage underwriter for permission to live. I instructed my broker to submit an all-cash offer with a 3-day closing window. The seller accepted within the hour. I sat in a sleek conference room at the title company and executed the wire transfer directly from my high-yield savings account. There were no predatory balloon payments hidden in the fine print. There was no leverage. I traded a fraction of my liquid capital for a deed that carried only my name. I owned the soil free and clear, achieving the ultimate Midwestern metric of success without ever seeking my family's approval or playing by their rules. The move took less than 48 hours. My minimalist lifestyle made the transition effortless. I hired a private logistics crew to transport my carefully curated furniture, and by Sunday evening, my new home was fully operational. I returned to my rented loft one final time to ensure the space was spotless. I scrubbed the baseboards, polished the quartz counters, and left the keys on the kitchen island alongside a perfectly typed forwarding address for my security deposit. The regional property manager who had fabricated my eviction would find nothing to penalize. Meanwhile, my phone remained silent on my end, but Wyatt continued to send messages. He texted me a link to a local homeless shelter accompanied by a laughing emoji. He asked if I needed him to drop off a sleeping bag. He and my mother firmly believed their retaliatory strike had ruined my life. They assumed I was currently hopping between friends' couches, devastated by the loss of my apartment and terrified of the future. I let them believe it. Silence is a mirror, and when you refuse to react, arrogant people will simply stare at their own reflection and declare victory. I directed my focus to the new home office. I unpacked my workstation, connected my dual monitors, and initiated the final phase of my strategy. A stack of physical evidence means very little if the audience cannot comprehend the narrative. I am a data scientist, and my primary skill is translating complex, chaotic information into undeniable visual truth. I decided to build an interactive digital dashboard structuring the presentation exactly like a corporate forensic audit. I coded a clean, minimalist user interface. On the main screen, I programmed a dynamic timeline mapping the exact dates of Henry's declining health against the dates of the unauthorized wire transfers. I created a visual flowchart tracking the stolen funds, drawing bright red vectors from the farm operating reserves directly into the shell corporation Wyatt had registered at the strip mall. I integrated the property records, placing the fraudulent secondary mortgage documents side by side with the authentic bank signatures. The centerpiece of the dashboard was the forgery analysis. I coded a high-resolution magnification tool that allowed the user to overlay my mother's known handwriting samples directly on top of the forged signature on the mortgage guarantee. The sharp ascenders and rigid loops aligned with mathematical certainty. Right next to the signature analysis, I embedded the digital footprint of Brenda Vance, linking the illegal notary stamp directly to the social media photographs of her romantic involvement with my brother. Every single data point was backed by certified municipal records, encrypted banking logs, and my grandfather's handwritten ledger. I mirrored the entire presentation on a secure cloud server and copied the executable files onto 3 separate hardware encrypted flash drives. The weapon was fully loaded, visually unassailable, and ready for deployment. The following Tuesday, the environment shifted. My father sent a brief text message stating that the hospice center had called the family in. I drove to the facility and parked in the visitor lot. The sky was overcast, casting a flat gray light over the medical campus. I walked into the quiet room where my grandfather lay. His breathing was shallow and uneven, the final rhythmic struggle of a body shutting down. My father stood by the window, staring out at the parking lot, his shoulders slumped in genuine sorrow. Susan and Wyatt were stationed near the door, keeping a polite distance from the bed. I stepped forward and took Henry's hand. His skin felt cool and fragile like thin parchment. I did not speak, but I squeezed his fingers silently, promising him that the ledger he had suffered to build would not be buried. Henry passed away peacefully 10 minutes later. The monitors leveled out, and the room descended into a heavy, unbroken quiet. The immediate aftermath showcased the profound emotional bankruptcy of my mother and brother. They did not weep. They did not seek comfort. Within 20 minutes of the attending physician logging the official time of death, Susan and Wyatt stepped into the hallway to strategize. I lingered near the doorway, listening as their whispered conversation echoed off the linoleum tiles. Susan told Wyatt they needed to schedule a contractor immediately. She complained that the farmhouse kitchen was horribly outdated and needed granite countertops before they could even think about hosting the autumn harvest dinner. Wyatt agreed, adding that he wanted to tear down the old tractor shed to build a climate-controlled garage for his luxury vehicles. They were carving up the property before Henry's body had even been transported from the facility. They operated under the assumption that the ancestral land now belonged to them, a prize they had secured through forgery and theft. Their planning was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Caldwell. The estate attorney walked down the corridor, his briefcase gripped tightly in his hand. He offered his condolences to my father, his voice steady and professional. He then turned his attention to Susan and Wyatt, who immediately straightened their posture and adopted their faux grieving expressions. Susan thanked Caldwell for coming, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. She asked how quickly they could expedite the probate process, citing her desire to preserve her father's legacy without delay. She wanted the keys to the kingdom, and she wanted them that afternoon. Caldwell adjusted his glasses and looked at her with a cold, practiced neutrality. He informed her that the estate required a formal reading of the final will and testament before any assets could be accessed or discussed. He stated that the legal transition of power was a rigid process, and he would not entertain any requests regarding the property until the designated beneficiaries were formally notified of the deceased's intentions. Wyatt crossed his arms and asked when the reading would take place, his tone laced with impatience. He needed the estate funds to clear his impending balloon payment, and the commercial land sale had already fallen through. His financial survival depended on this inheritance. Caldwell pulled a leather-bound scheduling book from his jacket pocket. He flipped to the current week and ran his pen down the page. He looked up at my mother and brother, and then his eyes flicked briefly toward me. He announced that the official will reading would take place at his downtown office on Friday morning at precisely 9 o'clock. He advised everyone to be punctual, noting that the contents of the new legal structure would require their undivided attention. The stage was set, the timeline was locked, and Friday would bring a reckoning they could never have predicted. The morning of the funeral blanketed the county in a humid, oppressive gray. In our specific corner of the Midwest, funerals function less as a venue for mourning and more as a theater for social hierarchy. The community gathers to measure the quality of the floral arrangements, the cut of the dark suits, and the volume of the tears. My mother treated the event like the defining performance of her lifetime. Susan wore a tailored black dress that hit exactly at the knee. Pairing it with dark sunglasses she removed only to dab her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She greeted the steady stream of attendees at the church doors, accepting their condolences with rehearsed grace. She murmured about how Henry was the last of a dying breed, positioning herself as the sole keeper of his legacy. Wyatt stood rigid by her side, adopting the posture of a stoic heir, shouldering the burden of a 300-acre empire. He shook hands with the local bank managers, the hardware store owners, and the neighboring farmers. He projected strength, but his eyes constantly scanned the crowd, perhaps looking for the commercial developers he still hoped to court, or the loan officers he desperately needed to appease. I stood in the back pew observing the spectacle. I did not participate in the receiving line. I watched them interact with the townspeople the same way I monitor anomalous data points, shifting across a scatter plot. They were expending an enormous amount of energy, projecting an image that no longer aligned with reality. My father sat in the front row, staring blankly at the polished oak casket. Richard was the only person in the room experiencing genuine sorrow, yet his passive nature rendered him invisible, while his wife and son commandeered the spotlight. The service concluded, and a long procession of vehicles followed the hearse to the local cemetery. The burial was brief, punctuated by a harsh wind sweeping across the flat plains. As the pastor delivered the final prayer, the crowd began to disperse, walking slowly back to their parked cars. The tradition dictated that everyone would now drive to the ancestral farmhouse for a catered reception. The local church auxiliary had already delivered trays of baked goods and casseroles to the property. I turned toward my sedan, buttoning my coat against the chill. Before I could reach my door, my mother intercepted me on the gravel path. Wyatt trailed closely behind her, jingling a heavy ring of brass keys in his pocket. The keys to the farmhouse. Susan did not bother lowering her voice. She wanted the lingering attendees to witness her assert control. She stepped directly into my path and crossed her arms. Her face hardened, shedding the fragile grieving widow persona she had worn inside the church. She told me I was not welcome at the reception. The words hung in the brisk air. I looked at her, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I asked her to clarify her statement. Susan gestured toward the horizon, pointing in the general direction of the farm. She said the farmhouse was a place for people who understood the value of the soil. She stated that my lifelong refusal to invest in real estate and my constant defense of my transient renting lifestyle demonstrated a profound lack of respect for the land Henry had bled to cultivate. She said my presence would insult his memory on the very day they laid him to rest. Wyatt stepped forward, puffing out his chest. He added that the family needed to discuss the future of the agricultural operations with the neighboring landowners over lunch. He claimed the conversation required a level of financial sophistication I simply did not possess. He told me to go back to my little apartment in Omaha and leave the heavy lifting to the adults. He patted his pocket, drawing attention to the sound of the brass keys. He was officially locking me out. I studied their faces. They were high on the illusion of power. They believed they had just conquered the kingdom and banished the only dissenting voice. They did not know the locks they were so proud to change belonged to doors I already owned. They were trespassing on my property, dictating the guest list for a reception held on my land funded by money they had stolen from my trust. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or demand entry. I simply offered a brief nod, stepped around them, and opened my car door. I told them to enjoy the reception. I drove away from the cemetery, leaving them standing on the gravel path. I navigated the highway back to Omaha, the tension draining from my shoulders with every passing mile. I did not return to the rented loft they despised. I drove to the historic tree-lined neighborhood where my newly purchased brick home sat bathed in the late afternoon sun. I pulled into the private driveway, unlocked my front door, and stepped into the quiet sanctuary I had secured with cash. The contrast between my reality and their delusion was stark. They were heading to a farmhouse burdened by a forged secondary mortgage, desperately trying to maintain a facade of wealth while a balloon payment threatened to ruin them. I was standing in a fully owned property, immune to eviction, insulated from their chaos. I walked into my home office and powered on my dual monitors. The emotional theatrics of the day were irrelevant. The only thing that mattered now was Friday morning. I launched the encrypted digital dashboard I had coded earlier in the week. I needed to execute a rigorous dry run of the presentation to ensure the technology would not fail during the most critical moment of my life. I clicked through the user interface, navigating the timeline of Henry's declining health. I verified the database connections, linking the unauthorized wire transfers to the Shell Corporation records. I opened the visual flowchart, watching the bright red vectors track the stolen funds from the farm reserves directly into Wyatt's registered accounts. The transitions were seamless. I tested the hyperlinks embedded in the forgery analysis section. I clicked the icon representing the fraudulent secondary mortgage. The high-resolution scan of the document expanded across the screen. I activated the magnification tool, overlaying my mother's verified handwriting samples over the forged signature. The sharp ascenders aligned perfectly. I clicked the adjacent link and the digital footprint of Brenda Vance materialized, connecting the illegal notary stamp to the social media evidence of her romantic relationship with my brother. Every single data point loaded instantly. The evidence was undeniable, organized with clinical precision. I backed up the executable files to the 3 encrypted flash drives, placing them neatly in my leather briefcase. The evening passed in silence. I prepared a simple dinner, reviewed my notes, and went to sleep early. My mind was clear. The trap was fully constructed, and the bait had already been taken. Friday morning arrived with bright, unfiltered sunlight. I woke up at dawn and prepared for the day with the same focus I apply to a major corporate deployment. This was not a family gathering. This was a hostile boardroom takeover. I bypassed my usual casual tech industry attire and opened the garment bag hanging in my closet. I chose a tailored charcoal gray suit. The fabric was sharp, unforgiving, and projected absolute authority. It was armor designed for a professional battlefield. I paired it with a crisp white blouse and polished leather shoes. I tied my hair back into a sleek, severe style, ensuring no loose strands would distract from my face. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back did not look like a transient renter or a disappointing daughter. She looked like an apex predator prepared to dismantle a fraud ring. I picked up my briefcase and drove downtown. The streets were quiet, the morning commute just beginning to swell. I arrived at Mr. Caldwell's office building 20 minutes before 9 o'clock. The receptionist had just unlocked the front doors. She smiled warmly, remembering me from my previous urgent visits. She pointed down the hallway, indicating that the main conference room was already prepared for the reading. I walked down the corridor and pushed open the heavy glass door of the conference room. The space was intimidating, featuring a long, polished walnut table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. A large flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall served for displaying legal exhibits. I walked directly to the head of the table. The head of the table is a position of undeniable psychological power. It dictates the flow of conversation and commands the visual focus of the room. It was the seat my grandfather would have taken, and it was the seat Wyatt fully intended to occupy. I set my briefcase on the smooth wood, unlatched the brass locks, and extracted one of the encrypted flash drives. I plugged it into the interface port connected to the wall monitor. I sat down in the heavy leather chair, adjusted my cuffs, and rested my hands flat on the table. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9. I listened to the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, my pulse steady and calm. I was the sole legal trustee of the estate, the architect of their impending ruin, and I was exactly where I belonged. A few moments later, the chime of the elevator echoed down the hall, signaling the arrival of the very people who thought they had locked me out of the family forever. The heavy glass door to the conference room swung inward. My family entered the space. Susan led the procession, carrying a designer handbag she purchased specifically for this occasion. She viewed the reading not as a legal procedure, but as a coronation. Wyatt walked a half step behind her. He gripped his cell phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The deadline for his balloon payment acted like a predator breathing down his neck, and he viewed this room as his only sanctuary. Richard trailed them, keeping his eyes on the floorboards, a man merely serving out a quiet sentence in a marriage he surrendered to decades ago. When they saw me sitting at the head of the long walnut table, the rhythm of their entrance fractured. Susan stopped so abruptly that Wyatt nearly collided with her shoulder. She stared at my charcoal gray suit. Her eyes narrowed as she processed the visual data. I was no longer the transient renter she could mock into submission at Sunday dinners. I occupied the physical and psychological anchor of the room. Wyatt recovered first. He walked toward me, projecting the artificial confidence he used to close bad real estate deals. He pointed a finger at the door and told me I was in the wrong chair. He said the head of the table was reserved for the primary heir, the person tasked with managing the agricultural assets. He instructed me to slide down to the visitor section and let the adults handle the transition of power. I did not move. I did not blink. I kept my hands folded on the polished wood and looked back at him. I told him I was perfectly comfortable exactly where I was. Susan let out a sharp sigh. She told Wyatt not to indulge my tantrums. She claimed I was acting out because I felt excluded from the grown-up conversation. She took the seat directly to my right, placing her handbag on the table like a territorial marker. Wyatt took the seat to my left, his jaw tight. Richard sat at the far end, placing as much physical distance between himself and the impending transaction as the room allowed. The side door of the conference room opened. Thomas Caldwell walked in holding a single sealed document folder. He did not sit at the head of the table. He took a position standing near the wall monitor, placing the folder on a wooden side lectern. He offered a brief, solemn nod in my direction. Susan caught the exchange. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, a brief interruption in her otherwise impenetrable entitlement. She expected Caldwell to defer to her. She held the limited medical proxy. She believed she held the keys to the kingdom. Caldwell adjusted his glasses and broke the wax seal on the folder. The sound of tearing paper echoed in the silent room. He cleared his throat and announced that he was executing the final will and testament of Henry Blondell. The air in the room grew thick. Susan leaned forward, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on Caldwell's lips. Wyatt shifted in his leather chair, his knee bouncing in a rapid, anxious rhythm. They were vibrating with anticipation. They were mentally spending the capital before the ink was even verified. Wyatt needed the cash to clear his forged secondary mortgage. Susan wanted the title to the ancestral soil to solidify her social standing in the county. They viewed Henry's death merely as a financial transaction that was finally clearing escrow. Caldwell began reading the preamble. The legal phrasing was dense and archaic, establishing Henry's sound mind and deliberate intent. Caldwell read slowly, ensuring every syllable carried its intended legal weight. He navigated the standard introductory clauses detailing the payment of final medical expenses and the settlement of minor outstanding municipal taxes. Then the cadence of the document shifted. Caldwell turned a page and his voice hardened. He read a specific targeted clause that Henry had drafted with surgical precision. I hereby revoke, cancel, and render null and void any and all prior powers of attorney, financial proxies, and medical directives previously granted to my daughter Susan Blondell and my grandson Wyatt Blondell. The bouncing in Wyatt's knee stopped instantly. Susan sat back in her chair, her brow furrowing. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but Caldwell raised his hand, a sharp gesture demanding unbroken silence. He continued reading. I declare that all prior trusts' joint account authorizations and land management agreements are dissolved effectively immediately upon the date of this signing. The color began to drain from Susan's face. The legal shield she had used to access Henry's reserves was evaporating into thin air. Wyatt gripped the armrests of his chair. He leaned toward Caldwell and demanded to know what the attorney was talking about. He claimed there was a misunderstanding, stating that they were the designated caretakers of the estate. Caldwell ignored the outburst. He turned to the asset distribution section. This was the moment the trap sprang closed. To my daughter Susan and my grandson Wyatt, I leave exactly nothing. You shall inherit no acreage, no liquid capital, no farm equipment, and no intellectual property associated with this family. You shall inherit only the debts you legally incurred under your own names. The room descended into a suffocating vacuum. For 3 seconds, no one drew a breath. The words defied their entire worldview. In their minds, the land was a birthright. The wealth was guaranteed. The idea that a man could simply write them out of the narrative shattered the foundation of their identity. Then the vacuum broke. The room erupted. Susan slammed her hands onto the walnut table. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the carpet. She pointed a trembling finger at Caldwell. She screamed that the document was a forgery. She claimed Henry was suffering from advanced dementia when he signed it. She shouted that he lacked the cognitive capacity to understand what he was doing, and that Caldwell had manipulated a dying man. She declared she would hire a team of litigators to sue the estate, drag the firm through the mud, and invalidate every single page of that will. Wyatt was on his feet beside her. His face flushed a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. His balloon payment was due. The commercial land sale had failed. And now his inheritance was wiped out. He was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin and public humiliation. He yelled at Caldwell, demanding to see the signature on the document, accusing the attorney of malpractice. Richard remained seated at the far end of the table. He stared at his wife and son, his eyes wide with a quiet, dawning horror. He was finally witnessing the raw, unfiltered greed that had driven his family for years. Caldwell did not flinch. He let the chaos swirl around him for a moment. Then he slammed his palm flat against the lectern. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, silencing Susan mid-sentence. He instructed them to sit down and listen to the final clause warning them that their current behavior would be documented for the probate judge. Susan lowered herself slowly back into her chair, her chest heaving. Wyatt remained standing, hovering over the table, his fists clenched at his sides. Caldwell adjusted his glasses one final time. He looked directly at me, acknowledging my presence at the head of the table. He read the closing directive. I name my granddaughter Meredith Blondell as the sole trustee, the sole executor, and the absolute and undisputed beneficiary of my entire estate. I make this decision based on her demonstrated professional integrity, her unyielding financial discipline, and her respect for the truth. She alone is prepared to lead. Silence crashed back down onto the room. Susan turned her head slowly, her neck rigid. She stared at me, her eyes wide, processing the reality that the daughter she had mocked for 15 years, the woman she ridiculed for renting a minimalist apartment, now owned the ground she walked on. She realized she was sitting in a room where I held all the cards. Wyatt could not process the defeat. His arrogance would not allow it. He lunged forward, pressing his hands flat onto the table, leaning his entire body weight toward me. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He showed his teeth, a desperate predator cornered by a changing ecosystem. He told me I was not taking a single acre. He promised to tie the estate up in probate court for the next 2 decades. He swore he would file injunctions, contest the mental competency evaluation, and drain every single dollar of the farm reserves into legal fees before he ever let a renter take title to his soil. He thought he had leverage. He believed the threat of a prolonged, expensive legal war would force me to negotiate to carve out a piece of the pie just to make him go away. He did not know the farm reserves were already gone. He did not know I had traced every stolen dollar. He was entirely unaware that I sat with my hand resting on the computer mouse connected to the flash drive in the wall monitor, preparing to drop a hammer that would shatter his world into dust. Wyatt stood looming over the polished walnut table. His breath came in ragged, uneven bursts. He promised a legal war that would span decades. He promised to drain the estate accounts until nothing remained but dirt and unpaid attorney fees. He thought his sheer volume equated to power. He believed intimidation could rewrite the legal reality established by Mr. Caldwell just moments prior. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I simply reached forward and tapped the spacebar on my laptop keyboard. The large flat-screen monitor mounted on the conference room wall flickered to life. The glowing display cast a stark bluish light across the faces of my family members. I looked up at my brother. I spoke in a quiet, measured tone that carried easily through the silent room. I told him he could not sue an estate he had already defrauded. The words stopped his tirade instantly. His mouth hung open. Susan stiffened in her chair, her eyes darting from my face to the glowing monitor. Richard slowly lifted his head, his gaze fixing on the screen. I directed their attention to the digital dashboard. I explained that I build predictive models and track anomalies for a living. I told them that arrogant people leave distinct digital footprints every time they take a step in the dark. I clicked the first presentation module. A clean, minimalist timeline materialized on the screen. It cross-referenced Henry's declining health records with the exact dates of unauthorized withdrawals from his primary operating reserves. A bright red graph spiked upward, charting the theft of $400,000 over a 3-year period. Susan opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. I did not give her a chance to recover or formulate a lie. I advanced to the next slide. The screen populated with banking transit data. I explained that the money did not vanish into thin air. It traveled through regional banking hubs and landed in a specific destination. I displayed the corporate registration documents for Great Plains Holdings. I highlighted the registered agent, Wyatt Blondell. I highlighted the registered address, a vacant strip mall unit located 3 towns over. I watched the false bravado drain from Wyatt's face in real time. His knees gave out. He collapsed back into his leather chair, his eyes glued to the monitor. He was watching his own crimes broadcast in high definition. I advanced the presentation again. The screen shifted to a side-by-side comparison. On the left, I displayed the dates of the stolen wire transfers. On the right, I displayed Wyatt's public acquisitions. The down payment on his sprawling estate, the purchase of his luxury truck, the invoice for the custom stone fire pit Susan had bragged about at Sunday dinner. Every single dollar was accounted for. The math was flawless. Susan attempted to intervene. She adopted a trembling, defensive tone, grasping at the only excuse she could invent. She claimed Henry gave them that money. She said her father wanted Wyatt to succeed and authorized those transfers to help build the family brand. She was lying and she knew it, but she was trapped. I nodded, acknowledging her desperate pivot. I clicked my computer mouse. I told her that if Henry wanted to fund Wyatt's lifestyle, he would not have required a forged secondary mortgage to do it. The high-resolution scan of the municipal lien appeared on the monitor. The document pledged the 300-acre ancestral farm as collateral against Wyatt's impending balloon payment. Richard let out a sharp, ragged gasp. My father had spent his entire life avoiding debt. He lived in fear of financial instability, allowing Susan to manage their retirement accounts because he believed she shared his conservative values. He was looking at a legal document that risked the entire Blondell legacy for a reckless real estate gamble. I zoomed in on the signature block at the bottom of the mortgage agreement. The name Henry Blondell filled the screen. I explained that algorithms are exceptionally proficient at pattern recognition. I brought up a secondary image. It was a collection of Susan's handwritten grocery lists, birthday cards, and church volunteer sign-up sheets. Susan had always prided herself on her meticulous, elegant penmanship. That vanity was now her undoing. I activated the digital overlay tool. The distinct rigid loops and the severe leftward slant of Susan's cursive aligned perfectly with the forged signature on the legal document. I stated the fact clearly and without emotion. Susan had forged her dying father's signature to secure a fraudulent loan for her son. The silence in the room was suffocating. But I was not finished. I moved to the final piece of the puzzle. I highlighted the official state notary stamp located next to the forged signature. Brenda Vance. I clicked the final link on the dashboard. The screen flooded with social media photographs pulled from Wyatt's hidden secondary accounts. Images of Wyatt and Brenda Vance drinking at a regional casino, their arms wrapped around each other, posted just weeks before the mortgage was filed. I explained that Wyatt was romantically involved with the notary who rubber-stamped the felony fraud. The illusion of the perfect Midwestern family shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right there in the conference room. Richard turned his head slowly. He looked at his wife of nearly 40 years, as if she were a dangerous stranger who had broken into his home. His voice was a hollow, broken rasp. He asked Susan what she had done. Susan shrank back into her chair. Her designer handbag slipped off the table and crashed onto the carpet. She reached a shaking hand toward Richard's arm, pleading with him. She claimed she only did it to protect Wyatt. She said the commercial developers were going to buy the 50 acres and make the whole thing disappear before anyone found out. She confessed to the entire scheme in her blind panic to retain her husband's loyalty. Richard pulled his arm away from her touch. He realized the terrifying scope of the betrayal. Susan had not just risked the ancestral farm. By engaging in mortgage fraud across state banking lines, she had exposed their own household to catastrophic legal and financial liability. The retirement they had saved for the house they lived in, everything was now tainted by her criminal conspiracy. She had risked their own survival to coddle a son who refused to live within his means. Wyatt turned on his mother instantly. The stoic air vanished, replaced by a terrified debtor desperate for a scapegoat. He pointed a shaking finger at Susan. He shouted that the forged signature was her idea. He claimed she forced him to use Brenda to notarize the paperwork. He threw the woman who had ruined her own life to save his directly under the bus. Susan shrieked back at him. She reminded him that he was the one who signed the predatory balloon mortgage in the first place. She yelled that he begged her for the cash because he was too incompetent to sell enough houses to cover his own vanity. She called him a failure, unleashing the very insult she had reserved for me my entire life. They tore each other apart. The polite, refined facade they wore to church and country club dinners dissolved into ugly, vicious recriminations. They screamed accusations, each trying to pin the majority of the blame on the other to avoid the inevitable consequences. They sounded like trapped animals fighting over a shrinking patch of dry land. Mr. Caldwell stood silently by the wall, watching the self-destruction with a cold, professional detachment. He had seen families fight over money before, but the sheer volume of undeniable evidence I had provided rendered their arguments entirely pointless. I sat at the head of the table, my hands resting on the smooth wood. I did not smile. I did not interrupt their civil war. I simply watched the data finalize its inevitable conclusion. The emotional hierarchy they had weaponized against me for my entire adult life lay in ruins on the conference room floor, destroyed by the very independence they had always despised. The chaotic screaming match between my mother and brother burned bright and fast, exhausting their adrenaline within a matter of minutes. They stood panting in the center of the conference room, the echoes of their vicious accusations fading into the quiet hum of the overhead ventilation system. They slowly turned their attention back to the head of the table. The digital dashboard remained glowing on the wall monitor behind me, casting a cool blue light over their flushed faces. The undeniable proof of their crimes hung in the air, a silent judge they could no longer outrun. As the reality of their situation settled over them, their aggression evaporated. Cornered predators often realize that baring their teeth will not break a steel trap. When intimidation fails, they pivot to the only other tactic they know. They rely on manipulation. Wyatt was the first to change his approach. The arrogant real estate agent who had strutted into the office demanding I surrender my chair vanished. His shoulders slumped, and the rigid posture he used to project wealth folded inward. He stumbled forward, bracing his hands on the edge of the walnut table to support his weight. His chest heaved and tears began to well in his eyes. These were not the fake tears of a man playing a role for a sympathetic audience. This was the raw, unfiltered terror of a debtor who knew the game had reached its terminal end. He looked at me, his face pale and slick with sweat. He started to beg. He told me I did not understand what the bank would do to him. He explained that federal mortgage fraud carried mandatory prison sentences. He said he would lose his real estate license, his reputation, and his freedom. His voice cracked as he detailed the impending public humiliation that would destroy his life. He pleaded with me to use my newfound authority as the trustee to grant him mercy. He said the estate held hundreds of acres of prime agricultural soil. He begged me to just sell a small parcel, perhaps the exact 50 acres he had tried to offload to the commercial developers. He asked me to cut him a single check to pay off his balloon mortgage. He promised he would pay the trust back with interest. He swore he would change his ways, leave the state, and never bother me again. He reduced himself to a trembling shell, hoping my pity would override my logic. Susan watched her golden child disintegrate in real time. She looked toward my father for support, but Richard had already retreated to the far corner of the room. He stood with his back turned to her, staring out the window at the morning traffic. He had officially recused himself from her defense, recognizing the toxic scope of her actions. Left entirely isolated, Susan made a decision that defied every ounce of vanity she possessed. She stepped away from her designer handbag, walked to the edge of the table, and sank to her knees on the carpeted floor. This was a woman who spent her entire adult life judging neighbors for having unkempt lawns. She curated her image with ruthless precision, wearing pearls to the grocery store to ensure everyone recognized her perceived status. Seeing her kneel in a law office, her tailored black dress pooling around her legs, was a profound visual paradox. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her carefully applied makeup. She reached her hands forward, grasping the edge of the polished wood. She weaponized the ultimate cultural guilt trip, digging deep into the Midwestern mythology she worshipped. She told me that family carries family. She said that blood was a sacred bond requiring sacrifice and forgiveness. She reminded me that I had won the battle. I had the assets now. I held the title to the land and the keys to the vault. She told me that because I possessed the wealth, I carried the moral obligation to save them from ruin. Hearing that specific phrase triggered a distinct memory. When I was a child, Susan used those exact words every time she needed someone to absorb Wyatt's failures. If Wyatt broke a neighbor's window, family carries family meant I had to offer my allowance to pay for the glass. If Wyatt failed, a high school math class family carries family meant I spent my weekends doing his homework so he could maintain his athletic eligibility. She had always used the concept of loyalty as a leash to keep me bound to his incompetence. I sat in the heavy leather chair and looked down at them. I observed the mother who had mocked me for 15 years, calling my minimalist apartment a failure, and treating my financial discipline as a character flaw. I looked at the brother who had leveraged his country club connections to fabricate an eviction notice, trying to render me homeless just to teach me a lesson about power. They expected me to break. They assumed that underneath my quiet exterior, I harbored a desperate need for their validation, and that I would finally purchase their love by writing a 6-figure check. I reached forward and placed my hand on the lid of my laptop. I did not feel a surge of triumphant anger. I felt the calm, clinical detachment of a scientist concluding a successful experiment. I told them I do not finance bad investments. I pushed the lid down. The laptop snapped shut. The glowing dashboard on the wall monitor went dark, plunging the room back into standard office lighting. I kept my voice level and precise. I explained that real adults fund their own visions and suffer their own consequences. I stated that I would not sign a single check to cover a fraudulent loan. I would not liquidate an inch of my grandfather's soil to bail out a man who tried to steal it. I told Susan that her definition of family was just a billing structure, and my accounts were permanently closed to her. I refused to cover a single lie they had told the town. The truth was their problem now. Wyatt let out a hollow, agonizing groan and buried his face in his arms. Susan remained on her knees, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a new angle of manipulation that simply did not exist. Thomas Caldwell stepped away from the wall. He walked over to the side lectern and picked up a stack of legal documents he had prepared earlier that week. He approached the table and slid the heavy paper packets across the walnut surface. They came to a rest just inches from Wyatt's folded arms. Caldwell spoke with the icy authority of a seasoned litigator. He informed Susan and Wyatt that they were looking at formal cease and desist orders. He explained the legal parameters outlined in the paperwork. As the authorized representative of the trust, he was officially banning both of them from setting foot on the ancestral farm. They were prohibited from contacting the agricultural tenants approaching the property boundaries, or attempting to access any structures on the land. He stated that any violation of the order would be treated as criminal trespass and would result in immediate arrest. They were banished from the kingdom they had tried to conquer. Susan stared at the legal documents, her hands shaking. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the table. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered venom. She told me I was cold. She said I was a heartless machine who cared more about spreadsheets than human lives. She promised that the town would turn against me when they heard how I treated my own mother. Before I could formulate a response, a new sound pierced the quiet tension of the conference room. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail drifting through the thick glass windows facing the downtown streets. The sound grew steadily louder, bouncing off the concrete buildings outside. Sirens. Wyatt snapped his head toward the window. His eyes widened in sheer panic. He turned to me, his voice trembling with a renewed wave of terror. He accused me of calling the police. He shouted that I had set a trap to have him arrested right there in the law office. He backed away from the table, looking frantically toward the closed door. I furrowed my brow. I had not contacted law enforcement. My strategy relied entirely on civil litigation and asset protection. I had planned to let his balloon mortgage default naturally, allowing the bank to foreclose on his personal estate while I shielded the farm. I looked over at Mr. Caldwell, seeking clarification. The attorney adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and checked his wristwatch. He looked at Wyatt with a profound lack of sympathy. Caldwell explained that he was an officer of the court. He stated that attorneys operate under a strict code of ethics and fiduciary responsibility. When I provided him with the certified copies of the fraudulent secondary mortgage and the forged notary stamp earlier that morning, a specific legal protocol was triggered. Caldwell informed my brother that he had a binding legal obligation to notify the primary lien holder of the active fraud. The realization washed over the room. I had not called the police. Mr. Caldwell had contacted the bank's fraud department the moment the doors opened at 8 o'clock. The financial institution, realizing they were holding a 6-figure loan secured by forged collateral, did not hesitate. The bank called the authorities. They dispatched units to secure the debtor before he could flee the jurisdiction. The wail of the sirens grew deafening, converging on the street directly below the office building. The flashing red and blue lights reflected against the conference room windows, casting rapid, chaotic shadows across my brother's terrified face. The timeline had accelerated. The consequences had arrived. And I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, watching the inevitable result of bad data catching up to a fraudulent life. The heavy glass door of the conference room swung open, and 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside. They did not raise their voices, nor did they need to. The gravity of their presence drained whatever remaining oxygen existed in the room. They asked for Wyatt Blondell by name. Wyatt froze, his hands still gripping the edge of the walnut table. The arrogant real estate agent who had strutted into the office demanding I surrender my chair was gone. In his place stood a terrified debtor watching the consequences of his forged secondary mortgage arrive in real time. Wyatt attempted to rely on his usual charm. He stepped toward the officers with his hands raised in a placating gesture, wearing the same artificial smile he used to close bad property deals. He told them there was a simple misunderstanding regarding some familial paperwork. He suggested they step out into the hallway to clear things up away from the attorneys. The officers did not smile back. They did not step into the hallway. One officer calmly instructed Wyatt to turn around and place his hands behind his back, citing the active fraud complaint filed by the regional bank just minutes prior. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the quiet law office sounded like a gavel striking a block. Susan let out a sharp, breathless gasp, pressing her hands against her mouth. Richard remained frozen in the corner, staring at the floorboards. I sat at the head of the table in my charcoal gray suit and watched the officers escort my brother out the door. His tailored jacket wrinkled awkwardly around his bound wrists. The facade he had spent years cultivating crumbled in full view of the receptionist and anyone else waiting in the lobby. The fallout from that morning was swift, public, and undeniable. In our rural Nebraska County, social standing is fragile, built entirely on perception and property lines. When the perception shatters, the community reacts with ruthless efficiency. Wyatt was formally booked on felony charges related to bank fraud and forgery. The regional bank moved to protect their remaining capital without hesitation. When the deadline for his balloon payment arrived and passed without a wire transfer, the financial institution initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings. Wyatt lost the sprawling 5-bedroom estate he had used to measure his superiority. The bank placed padlocks on the custom front doors and seized the property. His luxury truck was towed from the driveway under the watchful eyes of his country club neighbors. The state regulatory board suspended his real estate license pending the outcome of his criminal trial, stripping away his ability to earn a living in the only industry he knew. The golden child of the family was left with zero assets, a ruined reputation, and a looming court date. Susan faced a similar legal peril. The digital forensic dashboard I had presented clearly implicated her in the forgery of my grandfather's signature. The bank threatened to include her in the federal conspiracy charges unless the stolen funds were immediately replaced. This was the moment Richard was forced to step out of the shadows. My father was a passive man who spent 4 decades working at a local manufacturing plant. He avoided conflict by retreating to his garage, quietly funding his pension and a separate retirement account. He endured my mother's social climbing by taking refuge in the stability of those conservative investments. He believed his golden years were secure. To keep his wife out of a federal penitentiary, Richard had to make the ultimate sacrifice. He contacted his financial advisors and initiated an early liquidation of his entire retirement portfolio. The financial penalties for early withdrawal were steep, slicing a huge percentage off the top of his life savings. The remaining balance was just enough to cover the restitution demanded by the bank, along with the exorbitant legal fees required to keep Susan out of a prison cell. Richard wrote the check that zeroed out 40 years of hard labor. To avoid sinking further into debt, they were forced to sell the family home, the very house where I had grown up, enduring their constant criticism. The cosmic irony of their situation materialized a month later. Stripped of their savings and their property, Susan and Richard had to find a place to live. The woman who defined human worth by acreage, who mocked my minimalist lifestyle and called me a transient for refusing to take on a mortgage, was forced to sign a lease. They downsized into a cramped 2-bedroom rented apartment on the outskirts of town. Susan now shared walls with strangers. She had to ask a property manager for permission to hang a picture or change a light fixture. The church auxiliary stopped calling her to host their luncheons. The country club acquaintances quietly removed her from their social registries. The isolation was her true punishment, a permanent exile from the elite circles she had sacrificed everything to impress. I did not attend the foreclosure auctions. I did not drive past their new apartment to gloat. I simply returned to my job as a data scientist at the logistics firm. My colleagues noticed no change in my demeanor. I wrote predictive algorithms during the day and managed the vast administrative duties of the Henry Blondell estate in the evenings. I now held the title to 300 acres of prime agricultural soil. I was the sole trustee tasked with preserving a legacy that had survived droughts and recessions. My family assumed I would sell the land to the highest bidder because I lived in the city. They thought my preference for a clean rented loft meant I possessed no respect for the earth. They were wrong. I respected the soil deeply, but I also understood my own limitations. I was an analyst, not a farmer. My grandfather knew this when he drafted the final will. He did not expect me to drive a tractor. He expected me to govern the asset with cold, rational discipline. I reached out to the agricultural department at the state university. I requested proposals from recent agronomy graduates who possessed modern, sustainable farming methods, but lacked the generational capital to purchase their own land. After conducting several rigorous interviews, I selected a collective of 4 young ethical farmers. They utilized drone mapping soil sensor networks and data-driven crop rotation. Their approach bridged the gap between my technological expertise and Henry's traditional legacy. I structured a long-term commercial lease that granted them full operational control of the acreage while ensuring the trust received a steady, sustainable yield. The soil would thrive, the local economy would benefit, and the Blondell name would remain on the deed. Several months passed since the dramatic confrontation in Mr. Caldwell's office. Autumn arrived in Omaha, bringing crisp morning air and a brilliant display of turning leaves. I woke up in the master bedroom of the historic brick home I had purchased with unencumbered cash. The house was quiet, insulated from the frantic noise of debt and deception that defined my past. I walked into the kitchen, my bare feet quiet against the restored hardwood floors. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, poured a cup, and carried it into my dedicated home office. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the pristine desk where I built the forensic dashboard that dismantled a fraud ring. I did not have to worry about eviction notices taped to my door. I did not owe a bank a single dollar for the roof over my head. I sat down in my chair and looked at the wall above my monitors. Hanging in a simple, elegant frame was the final page from my grandfather's leather ledger. The heavy, cursive ink stood out starkly against the aged parchment. I let them think I was blind so you could catch them in the light. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I had protected my peace. I had maintained my career. I had secured the true legacy of the only man who ever saw my potential. The ledgers were balanced, the debts were paid, and the quiet renter from Omaha now owned the entire board. There is a very specific mythology woven deeply into the fabric of the American Midwest. This culture teaches you from a very young age that a person lacks fundamental value until their name appears on a property deed. Society conditions us to believe that taking on 30 years of crushing financial liability is the ultimate hallmark of maturity and success. Neighbors expect you to sign your name to predatory loans to leverage your future for manicured green lawns and extra guest bedrooms, and to wear that suffocating stress like a badge of honor. They call this process building a foundation. They refer to it as putting down roots. In reality, for individuals like my brother, it was simply placing a polished crown on top of a rapidly sinking ship. My family operated under the tragic delusion that appearing wealthy was the exact same thing as actually possessing wealth. They worshipped the illusion of prosperity. They judged human character by the manufacturer of a vehicle parked in a driveway and the total square footage of a suburban floor plan. Because I rejected their religion, I became the designated failure at every Sunday dinner. They looked at my rented loft in Omaha and saw a woman who refused to grow up and face the real world. They looked at my quiet demeanor and interpreted it as a profound character flaw. They mistook my lack of a mortgage for a lack of ambition. What they failed to understand was that while they were busy sinking their limited resources into depreciating assets to impress their country club acquaintances, I was quietly accumulating the only two currencies that matter during a crisis. I focused entirely on financial liquidity and intellectual capital. Renting an apartment did not make me a transient citizen. Renting provided me with the supreme tactical advantage of flexibility. It kept my overhead exceptionally low and my savings rate incredibly high. I did not spend my weekends worrying about escalating property taxes or unexpected roof repairs. I spent my time analyzing data, refining my professional skills, and building a fortress of untouchable cash reserves. My silence at those dinner tables was never an admission of defeat. It was an observational tool used to gather intelligence. When you stop trying to argue with arrogant individuals, they often forget you are even sitting in the room. They let their guard down. They boast about their latest luxury purchases and hint at their desperate financial maneuvers, never realizing they are handing you the exact data points required to dismantle their entire facade. My mother and brother assumed my quiet nature meant I lacked the spine to stand up for myself against their relentless criticism. They never considered that I was simply collecting the facts and waiting for the perfect moment to deploy the truth. The fallout from that Friday morning in the law office permanently reconfigured the boundaries of my family structure. I do not hold on to anger regarding the situation because anger requires an ongoing emotional investment that I refuse to pay. I simply enforce strict distance. My father Richard still attempts to reach out across the chasm he helped create through his chronic inaction. Every few weeks, my cell phone vibrates with a brief text message from him. The messages are always awkward and polite. He asks about the weather patterns in Omaha. He asks if my car is running well and if I am staying healthy. He sends those messages hoping to bridge a gap that can never be closed. I understand his grief, but I also recognize his undeniable complicity. Richard watched his wife and son tear our family apart for years, and he chose the safety of his garage over the discomfort of holding them accountable for their actions. He sacrificed his life savings to keep Susan out of a federal penitentiary, sealing his own fate through his lifelong habit of avoiding conflict. I reply to his text messages with brief, cordial responses. I tell him the weather is fine. I tell him my car runs perfectly. I do not invite him to my home, and I do not visit him. Peace requires strict borders, and my borders are permanently closed to the chaos he enables. I do not follow the current events of my mother or my brother. The local gossip network occasionally filters updates down to me through former neighbors or distant relatives, but I rarely entertain the conversations. I know that Wyatt is navigating the penal system and grappling with the permanent loss of his professional real estate license. I know that Susan is learning how to navigate the harsh reality of sharing thin walls with noisy neighbors and asking a landlord for permission to request basic maintenance repairs. Their current existence is the exact life they spent 15 years ridiculing me for living. The universe possesses a remarkable sense of irony, delivering their punishment through the very lifestyle they once deemed beneath their dignity. They are forced to experience the world without the safety net of stolen generational wealth. I do not wish them ill, but I feel no obligation to rescue them from the consequences of their own reckless choices. They built their own cages, and now they must learn how to live inside them. True independence has nothing to do with square footage or property lines. It has nothing to do with the brand of clothes you wear or the type of vehicle you park in a climate-controlled garage. True independence is the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you can walk away from any toxic situation because your resources belong to you alone. It is the ability to look at people who demand your compliance and calmly say no without fearing the financial or social repercussions. My grandfather Henry understood this fundamental truth better than anyone. He spent his life working the soil, but he never let the dirt own his identity. He valued honesty over appearances, and he recognized that my detachment from the family mythology was the only trait capable of saving his legacy. The 300 acres of prime agricultural soil continue to thrive under my stewardship. The collective of young farmers I leased the land to are producing record yields using sustainable technology. They send me detailed monthly reports filled with crop data and soil analysis. I read their agricultural reports with profound satisfaction. The farm remains profitable and secure, protected from the predatory greed that almost consumed it just a few months prior. Henry's name remains on the deed, shielded by the legal trust I manage with strict precision. I saved the land by refusing to conform to the expectations of the people who tried to steal it. The soil is healthy. The local economy benefits from the harvest, and I never have to drive a tractor or pretend to be a traditional farmer. I often sit in my home office as the evening sun casts long shadows across my restored hardwood floors. The house is quiet, free from the suffocating anxiety of debt and the exhausting demands of performative wealth. I sip my coffee and look at the framed page from my grandfather's leather ledger hanging on the wall above my monitors. The handwritten ink serves as a daily reminder that the most dangerous person in the room is rarely the one shouting the loudest. The most dangerous person is the one quietly tracking the numbers, building the timeline, and waiting for the right moment to turn on the lights. We are taught to shrink ourselves to keep the peace in dysfunctional households. We are instructed to endure insults to subsidize the bad decisions of our relatives, and to sacrifice our own stability to uphold a fake image of family unity. But unity built on exploitation is just a hostage situation disguised as a holiday dinner. You do not owe your sanity to people who treat your success as a threat and your boundaries as an insult. You have the right to hoard your own resources to protect your own mental health and to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. I stopped paying the emotional tax my family demanded, and in doing so, I inherited the entire world. That is my story. A rented loft, a forged signature, a hidden ledger, and the total dismantling of a real estate empire using nothing but cold, hard data. If your family demanded you finance their fake success with your real peace, would you pay the rent, or would you buy them out? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories of women who stop shrinking to fit in.
We spend so much of our lives driving through manicured Midwestern neighborhoods, admiring the wide lawns, the three-car garages, and the pristine facades of traditional American success. We attend the Sunday services, the school fundraisers, and the neighborhood barbecues, constantly measuring our progress against the people living right next door. But if you look closely enough at the warm golden light spilling from those dining room windows, you might pause and wonder what it actually costs to keep those lights on. The story of the Blondell family is far more than just a dramatic tale of forged signatures, hidden ledgers, and a stolen inheritance. Stripped down to its raw foundation, it serves as a profound mirror, reflecting the quiet, often unspoken crisis of modern parenting. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when an entire culture prioritizes the appearance of success over the genuine character of its children. By looking at this family dynamic through a lens of deep reflection, focusing on wisdom, morality, and inner resilience, we can extract vital lessons about raising children in a society that too often confuses price tags with actual value. In our culture, we frequently suffer from a dangerous illusion. We confuse accumulation with achievement. We teach our children from a very young age that roots are made of square footage property lines and granite countertops. We inadvertently trap them in a cycle where human worth is measured by the ability to secure leveraged debt. This is the material illusion that completely consumed Susan and Wyatt. They lost their clarity, their fundamental wisdom, because they equated a predatory balloon mortgage with a moral victory. When a parent measures a child's value by their visible, tangible assets, they teach that child to build a life on shifting sand. Meredith's deliberate choice to rent a quiet, minimalist apartment was mocked at the dinner table as a failure to launch. Yet in that minimalism, she found a profound sense of sufficiency. She understood that true security does not come from owning the biggest house in a prestigious zip code. It comes from a liberated mind, unburdened by greed, and free from the exhausting, desperate need to impress strangers. As parents guiding the next generation, the question we must ask ourselves is simple but piercing. Are we guiding our children toward genuine, sustainable peace, or are we pushing them onto a treadmill of endless, empty acquisition? Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the Blondell family dynamic is their twisted, weaponized concept of love. "Family carries family," Susan often declared. On the surface, this sounds like a beautiful sentiment, a sturdy pillar of the traditional family structure. But beneath that phrase lurked a toxic enabler. In the name of maternal devotion, Susan manipulated the truth, played blatant favorites, and ultimately resorted to felony fraud to shield her golden child from his own incompetence. This is exactly where parenting so often derails. We confuse coddling with compassion. We mistake enabling for loyalty. True morality, true integrity requires a much heavier, much more difficult lift. It demands that we let our children feel the full weight of their own mistakes. Love without wisdom easily sours into poison. By constantly covering up Wyatt's financial failures and demanding that his highly competent sister absorb the emotional and financial cost, his parents robbed him of the opportunity to develop a spine. Real love means guiding a child onto an honest path and having the courage to step back and let them face the harvest of their own actions. When we force one capable child to set themselves on fire just to keep an irresponsible sibling warm, we aren't protecting the family, we are burning its foundation to the ground. Then there is the crucial matter of inner strength. Society often misinterprets dominance volume and the ability to bully others as real power. Wyatt swaggered through his town using intimidation, loud boasts, and a misplaced sense of entitlement to mask his suffocating panic. But true inner strength, the kind of quiet resilience that anchors a soul when the world tilts on its axis, is silent. Meredith embodied this quiet, unshakable fortitude. She did not scream when she was mocked at Sunday dinners. She did not throw tantrums when she was excluded from the family narrative. She simply observed, she gathered the truth, and she stood unmovable in the face of absolute chaos. As parents, this is the caliber of emotional awareness and resilience we should strive to instill in our homes. We must teach our children that they do not need to rely on the wealth of others, nor do they need to dominate a room to be powerful. True resilience is cultivated by building a life with clean hands and a clear conscience. It is the ability to remain perfectly still while the storm rages, knowing with absolute certainty that your foundation is built on truth, not leverage. The ultimate tragedy of the Blondell family was their chronic generational inability to look inward. They constantly projected their own insecurities, their obsession with local status, and their fragile egos onto their children. You cannot mold a child into a grounded, ethical, and emotionally aware adult if you are lost in your own maze of vanity and materialism. Before we can effectively guide our children, we have to do the hard work of repairing ourselves. Parenting is not about carving a child into a socially acceptable trophy to display for the neighbors. It is about doing the difficult internal work to ensure our own unresolved desires and past traumas do not become their burdens. When parents choose to live with genuine honesty, when they understand what truly matters beyond the balance of a checking account, and when they take accountability for their own flaws, that peaceful energy naturally trickles down. It creates a home that is a sanctuary of growth and mutual respect rather than a prison of toxic expectations. Meredith's final victory in that law office wasn't just a financial or legal triumph. It was a deeply spiritual one. Sitting in her own kitchen sipping coffee in the quiet morning light while looking at her grandfather's ledger, she represents the ultimate triumph of untangling oneself from a toxic legacy. She let go of the poison held fiercely onto her integrity and protected the truth. We all have to decide what kind of legacy we are leaving behind for the people sitting at our dinner tables. If stories like this resonate with you, if you find yourself nodding along because you recognize the quiet, desperate battles fought behind closed doors, we invite you to join our community. Follow the channel. Fluffy Revenge for more narratives that dive deep into the complexities of family drama, the pursuit of justice, and the courage it takes to finally find your own voice. As you turn off your screen today and step back into your routine, take a moment to look around your own living room. Listen to the quiet hum of your life. Ask yourself a hard question. Are the walls around you built with sturdy honesty, or are they held up by the exhausting, fragile effort of keeping up appearances? The answer might just change the way you look at your family forever.